I think peace of mind for clients is um, knowing if mom or dad dies, that what they're leaving is going to go to their kids. They're not going to pay a lot of taxes on it. There's not going to be a lot of fights because we've, set out who's going to get it. Um, and if they have a business like we talked about, that the business isn't going to have to be sold or it's not going to be impaired because one of them passed away and that they're going to be leaving something to their children, that their children and their grandchildren, next generations, are going to benefit from all the efforts that they put in during their lifetime.
Welcome to the Verdict Signal podcast, where we feature how top attorneys help people make informed choices, avoid common mistakes, and move forward with confidence. Now, enjoy the show, and here's your host.
Daniel Gao here. I'm the host of Verdict Signal, and today we're expanding our conversations to the experts who protect what people build, their careers, families, and businesses. I have Don Ford, the managing partner at Ford Bergner LLP, who focuses his practice on estate planning, probate, and guardianship matters in Texas. He is board certified in estate planning and probate by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization, one of the highest distinctions in the field. Don is also a trained mediator with coursework completed at Pepperdine Law's Strauss Institute for Dispute Resolution, specializing in probate and guardianship cases. He earned his accounting and law degrees from Baylor University, pursued additional graduate level tax coursework, and began his career as a tax attorney, building the deep tax and planning foundation that still shapes his work today. So Don, welcome and glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, let's start from the very beginning, Don. How did you first get interested in the legal field?
So, I'm one of those strange people that, in the fourth grade, I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. And from then on, that was the goal. I never wavered from that. It just was what interested me from a young age. And, my next door neighbor was the chief judge of the First Court of Appeals in Texas. And the guy that drove our carpool was the dad of, one of my friends. He was a lawyer. My best friend's dad, two streets over, he was a lawyer. I just was surrounded by these lawyers and I just thought it was interesting. And so ever since then, that's what I've wanted to do.
Okay, well, I guess you made it easy, figure that out early on in life.
I did,
So
yes.
now with the introduction, I talked about you starting off in the tax side of law, but what brought you over to the estate planning side of law?
So, when I went to law school, actually, I went to Baylor Law School in Texas, and Baylor actually had an interesting program that not most law schools at the time didn't have, and I don't think most have it now either, frankly. Which was you had the ability to have a specialization in a certain area of law while you were in law school, pursue kind of almost like an undergraduate major in a particular area. And my field of study was estate planning and business planning while I was in law school. And so I liked the concept then. I had an accounting undergraduate degree. I liked the concept of being able to do something that married, kind of that accounting side and the law side together. And estate planning has a lot of tax issues involved and, kind of financial issues and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And so I just enjoyed and thought I would enjoy long term, putting those two practice areas together. And I have, and I've really enjoyed it.
Got it. Now, Don, what's one thing that you wish more people understood about working with an attorney?
Look, I think that one of the misconceptions people have a lot of times about working with an attorney is, oh my gosh, it's going to be so complicated. I'm not going to really understand it. It's going to be very expensive. It's going to be this really onerous experience. And that doesn't have to be the case, right? I frequently have clients tell me, well, you made it so easy to understand it.
Mm,
And really, that's kind of that's a big goal of what I'm looking to do is to kind of relieve some of the mystery around the concepts. A lot of times the concepts aren't really that difficult. Everybody knows what a will is, basically, right? But they've got this misconception that it's going to be really difficult and hard to understand. And so part of my job is just breaking down that misunderstanding and helping them just understand it on a basic level, that the normal person, non-lawyer can understand.
okay. And I guess, how do you approach situations where, I mean, there's this misconception of how people view lawyers, that they don't always have a positive impression of lawyers. So how do you approach when people come to you? And I mean, when it comes especially to estate planning, like there's so much trust that needs to be built there, that they basically tell you their entire situation so you can put together the best plan for them. Like, how do you approach that with some of those people that may be a little bit more guarded, or they have this mindset of oh, like, I don't want to tell him everything because like he's a lawyer, so he upholds the law. So if I did something that maybe wasn't quite the right way of doing it, he's gonna get me in trouble, versus you are really their advocate for them to like best represent them.
Sure. No, that's a great question. So look, I mean, I think that having a conversation and just relating to somebody as a person, kind of like you and I are doing today, I mean, I think is the best way to start to overcome that reluctance. A lot of people perceive a lawyer is going to be unapproachable. They're going to be hard to talk to, things like that. If you can just engage in a conversation with them, and I like to know about their families. Husband and wife come in and they're at retirement age. Well, how many kids do you have? And tell me about your kids. What do they do? Where do they live? Do you have grandkids? I mean, just to get to know them. And I have a genuine, just, I like to talk with people and get to know those things. And so just relating to them as people as opposed to as clients or, the next case, I think really helps people to feel more at ease with those discussions. And it helps them to open up, let them talk. I like to ask them questions that allow them to talk as opposed to me doing all the talking.
Mhm.
There's a lot of lawyers out there that like to just do all the talking themselves. But that doesn't give the client the opportunity to tell you who they are. And I think it's important for the client to get to tell you about them. So
Okay.
that's usually my big goal in first meeting clients.
Okay. And what are the common situations that your clients come to you for? I know you specialize in the estate planning and also the probate side of it, but is there anything kind of more, or is there anything kind of deeper than just those two very broad areas?
So look on the estate planning side, there's probably two or three buckets you could define as the buckets of what people are looking for. You have the couple that's 35 to 40 years old, and they've got young children. And so they're worried about, well, if something happened to us while our children were young, who's going to take care of our children? Who's going to handle the money for them if they're young and we're gone? Who's going to care for them? And so, those are the clients that you're really focused on. Who are we designating to make those decisions, to care for them, to step in for mom and dad if they all of a sudden were not there and the kids were still young kids. In my personal life, I went to a small private school in high school, and there were only 13 girls in my graduating class for high school. And by the time I was 43, four of those 13 girls had already buried their husbands.
Hmm.
And all of them had young children at the time that they buried those husbands. In fact, one of them called me today when I was over on the way over here for this interview. And, we as friends helped to parent those kids, when their dads were all gone. But each of those situations presented a different story in terms of how the dads had planned for what happens if I'm gone. The first one there was no will, there was no plan, there was nothing like that. The second one was very well planned and had left quite a bit of money because he'd invested well, had planned well, had a good drafted will. And so there were just different scenarios. And so, we're worried with with that younger group about what happens if somebody dies at an untimely age. The second group is probably the 50-year-olds, roughly 50-year-olds that they've made some good money. Maybe they've created their own business. The business has done really well. They're thinking about selling a business and they're worried about the tax consequences. What's the tax consequence of selling this business? What's the estate planning consequence of selling the business? And so we're working with them to minimize the taxes, to make sure that the transition to the next generation is structured correctly, make sure we're protecting from creditors, things like that. And then the third bucket of people is probably the folks that are heading towards retirement. They're 65, they're 70, and they're thinking about, well, what happens if something happens to us? We've got kids, we probably have grandkids, and what do we want to do to benefit them, after having worked for a number of years and things like that. So you kind of see on the estate planning side, kind of those various buckets of clients.
Okay. Now, I want to dive back into the common misconceptions. You talked about a little bit about that earlier on, but what are some of the most common misconceptions you hear from your clients when it comes to estate planning? Like, for example, will, like you mentioned, the will is like, And if someone says that, oh, I have a will, I don't need estate planning. I guess we could start there.
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think probably one step before that is, do I even need a will, right? I don't own that much. I don't know that I need a will. Or the most common misconception I hear is, well, I'm married, so if I die, everything goes to my wife anyway, right? That's not necessarily true. Texas law, every state's law is different, but Texas law, if you're married and you have a child who is not also the child of the person to whom you're married, then your assets do not all automatically go to your surviving spouse if you die and have no will. Your child is going to get a substantial part of those assets rather than your spouse getting those assets. Um, that's not what a lot of people intend. So there's this misconception about what happens if I die without a will versus what happens if I die with a will. And then you get into, well, I don't have a whole lot, or my will's not complicated, or, I don't need to be too specific, or, nobody's going to fight over my stuff. There's all sorts of misconceptions along those lines.
Mhm. Okay. What about any other misconceptions that's kind of you heard most often, or even in some situations where you're explaining this to a client and they're like, "Oh, I didn't realize that was a thing."
Yeah, so look, I think that a lot of people don't understand the consequences of not having a will. Right. So you think in terms of, well, okay, so I die and I've got a house and it's going to just end up going to my kids. Well, the problem with that is, I mean, it may be right. If I'm single and I have three kids and I die and I don't have a will and all I have is a house, it's probably going to end up with all three of my kids. The problem is the process for doing it is significantly more difficult and more expensive. Difficulty equals expense.
Mhm.
If you don't have a will versus you do have a will. Second of all, all three kids are going to have the equal right to be in charge, to be the one to sell the house, to do all those things. What happens if your kids don't all get along? You haven't designated somebody to be in charge of those decisions. What happens with all the furnishings in the house? One child says, "Well, I want the china." The other child says, "No, I want the china." Well, how do we resolve that dispute over who gets the china?
Mhm.
That's kind of a smaller level. There's obviously it gets larger as you have larger estates and more complexity. But by having a will, you make that process shorter, it's less expensive, but also you give definition to who's going to be in charge of those decisions. Who's going to be in charge of dividing everything up between my kids? Who's going to be the one to sell my house? Let's say you have more assets, you've got a larger estate, you've got two kids, and you have a primary home in Texas and you have a vacation home on the coast in California. You might want one child to have the home in Texas, and you might want to have one child to have the home in California. You gotta say that in a will. If you don't, then it kind of creates somewhat of a chaos. So I think the biggest misconception there is that people don't understand really the difficulty that's created by not having a will.
Okay. I think that's a good segue into this next topic as far as probate goes. So for someone who's, especially if they've never done any type of estate planning, they probably don't know what probate is. So especially now talking about not having a will. So what is probate and why do you typically want to try and avoid probate?
Yep. So look, I mean, talk about common misconceptions. Probate has nothing to do with a criminal issue. It is not probation. And we get that question sometimes. But in general, probate is the process by which the court administers your will, right? So we're taking it from dad's estate and getting the assets ultimately to the kids, let's presume. And so there's a process involved to go from here to there, right? And so that's the probate process. It's the process of administering the estate. And so that administration piece has really kind of three distinct phases. One is identifying all the assets, making sure we know what dad owned. The second is paying off the debts. And then the third is distributing the assets to the beneficiaries under the will, or if there wasn't a will, then to the heirs at law under state law. So that probate process is going to be taking a will, presuming you have a good will, we're going to take it to court, we're going to get it recognized as the valid last will, and whoever's designated under that will to be the executor or the administrator, the person in charge, that person's going to be designated by the court to be in charge. And then we're going to move forward, wrapping up the affairs of the estate from there.
Okay. So pretty much probates when you have nothing in place and you have to deal with the courts and they're going to basically decide or figure out how your stuff was going to be divided amongst any living your family.
Correct. I mean, that no, you could have a will. You likely have a will in place, or hopefully you have a will in place, and so the probate will have will have the court recognizing that will is valid, right? So the court will say, okay, we determine that this will dated on this date is the valid last will of the decedent, and that the executor is given the authority to go and fulfill the terms of that will. So if it means dividing the house, selling the house and dividing the proceeds, the executor can go forward and sell the house and divide the proceeds. Or if somebody didn't have a will, they didn't have anything in place, then the court would fill in the gaps of what they didn't have in terms of who gets it, who's in charge, all those kinds of things. The court would make a decision on that.
Okay. So the will is basically the instructions that I leave when I pass away of what's going to happen with all my stuff. But I've heard of trusts. So if I have a will, do I need a trust? And how is a trust different from a will?
Yeah, so look, that's a great question. I mean, you're in California, and so in California, the trust concept is a very important concept. It's a little bit less important in Texas, and I'll kind of explain why. So in some states, California being one of them, the probate process is really an expensive, onerous, time-consuming process. And so the goal that a lot of people have is let me avoid that process altogether by having an estate plan that allows me to avoid that process. And so one common way of doing that is you can create a trust during your lifetime, and that trust will be revocable, meaning you can change it during your lifetime. So it's not set in stone until you're deceased. But if you put your assets in that trust during your lifetime, then at the time of your death, those assets pass under the trust agreement rather than having to go to court and pass under a will. So, a story I've told 1,000 times to illustrate this point to clients. I had some clients that came in over 20 years ago, and they were originally from Houston. They had moved to San Diego in the 1950s. They had bought two little bungalow cottages on the coast in San Diego for $30,000 and $40,000 a piece, respectively. Well, by the time that they died, by the time they came into me, which was a couple years before they both died, those houses were worth $1 million a piece, right? They'd increased in value significantly. And they had moved back to Texas at that point. Texas has a simple probate process, and they wanted to make the process easy. So we created a trust and we deeded those houses into the trust. And when they passed away a couple years later, we didn't go through probate in California. We didn't have any hassles in California. We just went and listed the properties for sale and sold them and divided the proceeds with the family. In California and some other states, it really eases that process and makes it a whole lot simpler, less expensive, less time consuming to avoid probate. And so that's the real goal with creating that trust.
Got it. And you mentioned that this is revocable. So you mentioned you can make changes during your lifetime. I'm assuming there's also an irrevocable trust. So, I mean, if the revocable is I can change it during my lifetime, why would you ever need or have a irrevocable trust?
Okay, so look, that's a great question. And so let's think about grandma, who grandma has several $1 million and she's got 10 grandkids, right? And so grandma says, well, before I die, I want to give some money to the grandkids, but I don't want it to go directly to the grandkids because they're young.
Mm,
And so she says, well, $20,000 a year I'm going to give to each grandchild, but I can't give it to them directly because they're only 3 years old.
mm,
So she can create a trust and she can give those gifts into that trust. And when she dies, that money is not considered a part of her estate.
mm,
That money can grow for those grandkids. But because she gave it to them, it's got to be an irrevocable gift. We're not going to take it back, right? And so the trust is irrevocable at that point because I'm giving it and I'm not going to get it back.
mm,
And so you can have a concept like that where mom or parents or grandparents want to give gifts to children or grandchildren. And that allows in my scenario, the grandmother could designate the grandchild's parent to be the trustee. The parent gets to manage it until the child's an appropriate age. And so, but you might also do an irrevocable trust if you had a large estate and you said, well, look, my business today is worth $1 million, but I think Amazon's going to come buy my business in the next 10 years. And when they do, they're going to buy it for $100 million. We could put that business in trust today for $1 million value. If it's an irrevocable trust, that $100 million sales price is going to escape estate taxes because we put it in that trust at a lower value. You're not going to escape capital gains tax, but you're going to escape estate tax. So there's some usually tax planning objectives to be achieved by having that irrevocable trust.
Okay, so it sounds like some people may have situations where they have a revocable and an irrevocable trust. Can you do that?
So you could, sure, you could do that. You might have, like I said, 10 different trusts for 10 different grandchildren, and those would all be irrevocable, and everything else that you own might be in your revocable trust. You could easily do that. You could transfer that business into a trust. It's irrevocable. You could sell the business and have $100 million in that irrevocable trust, and then you could have the rest of your assets. Your home, for instance, could be in the revocable trust. You could easily use a combination of both.
Okay, great to know. Now, when it comes to the mistakes people make, like what are some of the biggest mistakes you see people make before they end up calling a lawyer?
So look, let's piggyback on that last example about the business.
Hmm.
For business owners, the biggest mistake that they make is, and it's a natural mistake, but they work for, 10, 15, 20 years building their business. And all of a sudden they wake up one day and the business is now worth $50 million and they haven't done any planning before then. Well, now they've got an estate tax problem. We're going to write a big check to Uncle Sam when they pass away. So what they should have done is they should have come to me or somebody like me after 5 years and the business is worth $1 million and say, well, let's do something about planning for the hope that it's going to be worth a lot of money in the future. And we can take care of that earlier on in that process rather than later on in that process. So that's a big misconception that people have, right?
Mhm.
Second big misconception people have is, I don't really need a will. Oh, my kids will get along when I'm gone. Better to lay out what's going to happen than to leave it for people to wonder about.
Mhm.
Right? Look, I mean, some parents, they've got three kids, one child has special needs, the other two are highly successful, and they say, we're going to leave more to the special needs child because they're just going to need our help longer and more than our other two are.
Mhm.
That doesn't happen unless you say it in a will. Some parents say, look, we're completely estranged from one of our children, sadly, and we're just not going to leave that child anything. Well, if you don't have a will, that child's going to get the same thing that all of his other siblings get.
Mhm.
There's just things that you need to lay out in a will that if you don't, um, it's not going to turn out the way that you wanted it to. So that's a big misconception is I don't really need to worry about it.
Mhm.
Um, Another misconception, people don't spend enough time thinking about powers of attorney. Power of attorney allows you to designate somebody to make medical and financial decisions for you if you're alive, but you're not able to make those decisions while you're alive. So, for instance, you have a stroke, and all of a sudden, dad's not able to make any financial decisions any longer, or he's not able to make his healthcare decisions. Well, nobody gets to make those decisions for him unless they've been given authority to make those decisions. So those powers of attorney allow, dad to designate which of his kids or which of his friends or family members is going to be in charge of making those decisions if all of a sudden one day he can't make those decisions. That's equally as important as doing a new will, frankly.
Okay. Now, I'm sure, Don, that you get people that come in and be like, "Oh, well, I went on ChatGPT and they drafted up these documents for me. And can you just take a quick look over them, make sure they're okay?" So, what's the dangers of people using AI to draft up all of their documents, or using kind of like the ones like the Rocket Lawyer or whatever those paid services that just get you template documents?
Yeah, look, so one of the very first, so my firm, in addition to doing estate planning, we also have a team of people who litigate contested estates. Somebody, the family members are fighting over a will or something like that. And maybe not the very first, but one of the very first cases, 25 years ago, probably that I handled of a litigated matter was something similar where this guy had created this will on his own, and it said something about it, and I'm giving it to everything I own to this one sibling, and she shall share it with the others. Well, he thought, we feel confident, he thought that that meant share it equally with the others. He was just designating the one sibling to be in charge. Well, guess what? She took it as I get it all, and if I decide to give you some, I don't have to give you anything at all. I could share a little bit, I could share a lot. Um, it was, the decedent, the guy who died, he didn't know what the impact of his words was because he's not a lawyer, right? And so anybody out there trying to do it on their own, they don't know the impact of what those words mean or what they don't mean. And so it ends up creating a lot of confusion a lot of times when they're doing these various forms because the form is very standard and isn't customized or nuanced to your situation. And when people go in and try to customize it and nuance it to their situation, they don't understand the implication of the legal terms and all that. And so we just see that it makes a mess of a lot of those situations.
Okay. Now, let's say that someone is going through this journey of they do want to start doing their estate planning, or maybe it's too late and they're going through probate now, and they need help from a lawyer, but they don't know which one to choose. What advice would you give to this person as they're doing their search so they can find someone that's knowledgeable, experienced, and can help them get the end results they're looking for?
Yeah, look, so that's a great question because today more than ever, you're in California, which is a state with, lots of people, lots of lawyers. I'm in Texas, a state with lots of people, lots of lawyers. Lawyers are much more highly specialized on the whole than they ever have been before. Maybe if you went to Idaho or some small state that doesn't have a lot of lawyers, they might be more general in nature. But in your larger places like California and Texas, everybody's specialized. And there are a lot of lawyers who say, "Oh, it's just drafting a will," but that's not what they do normally. They're normally a personal injury lawyer, they're normally a criminal lawyer or something. You want to find somebody who actually does this type of work regularly. It is their practice. It's what they specialize in doing. And that's no shade to anybody who doesn't do this practice area. If you asked me to handle a personal injury case, I would be a terrible personal injury lawyer because I just don't do it.
Mhm.
If you wanted me to do a bankruptcy case, I'd be terrible at that. I just don't do it. Um, but so going to an attorney that is kind of a specialist in this particular area, that this is really kind of their only area of expertise, that's really the most important aspect of it because you don't want to mess these issues up. And some lawyer who just says, "Oh, I can probably do that," they probably can't.
Mhm. Okay. And what about the part of likability and connection? Like how important is that when you have to compare it to, let's say, ability or experience? Like obviously in a ideal world, you get someone who's really, really good at what they do and who you really connect with and who you really like and trust. But if you let's say you have a situation, people find a lawyer, it's like, oh, this person really, really knows what they're doing. They've done this a long time. I don't quite connect with them so much. Versus I found this other person, I really, really connect with them. They haven't been doing this as long, but who should I choose? Like, should I go for the person I really connect with and like, or the person who really has that experience and ability?
Look, you want to have the expertise, right? And expertise could be somebody that you like. Hopefully, it's you get both in the same package. Um, but hiring somebody just because you like them is not necessarily the best way to go about that. Now, that obviously you have to have somebody that you can work well with, and you should not hire a lawyer that you cannot have a good working relationship with. You may not like them as much as the other person, but if as long as you can have a good working relationship with them, that's what's most important.
Mhm.
But just choosing somebody because you like them and not because they're qualified, I don't think that's the best way to do that.
Okay. Now, when it comes to the future, where do you see the future of estate law going? Like, are there any big changes that people should pay attention to?
Look, I think one of the issues that I have talked about a lot in interviews and stuff, podcasts and stuff like that, like this one we're doing today, is over the next 20 years, between now and 2045, there's supposed to be this massive transfer of wealth because of the baby boomer generation dying and
Mhm.
transferring wealth. I mean, it's going to be just a tsunami of wealth transferring hands. And so I do think that as industry professionals, The challenge for us is meeting the need with the demand for services that all of that's going to create. I think from the client side, it's figuring out how to appropriately leave that money to the next generation and how the next generation is going to receive it and use it well and not be ruined by it because it's too much money or not squander it or things like that. So I do think there's a significant I guess we could describe it as an uptick of work that's likely to happen over the next 20 years that's going to put a lot of strain on the system of those of us that do this work. They do it on a high level anyway. It's going to put a lot of demands on people's time and require a lot of the clients as well, I think.
Okay. I've also heard some things as far as either the ceiling or I guess the limit on how much can be passed when a parent passes away and gives their estate to their children. So, is there really any big changes there, like as far as the limits changing massively, or is that kind of hard to tell? Is like it has, from my understanding, it has moved, but is it going to be like massive movements, like really bringing it down for the government to try and get more from taxes or increase it to try and pass that? Like, is there anything there that people can kind
Yeah.
of anticipate?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So look, whether you like Trump or hate Trump, this has nothing to do with Trump, right? The When Trump came into office the second time, there was this tax cliff that we were facing just because of some prior legislation and what the prior legislation from years earlier said about the expiration of the estate tax exemption. So when each person in the United States dies, they get to leave a certain amount of assets tax free for estate tax purposes to kids, grandkids, whoever they want to leave that to. So when Trump came into office, that was 12 or 13 million dollars a year, somewhere in that range. But because of that prior legislation, that was set to get cut in about half, and so it had gone down to 6 or 7 million dollars rather than 12 or 13 million dollars. Well, so last year, Congress and the White House adopted legislation that increased the estate tax exemption starting this year to $15 million per person. And it makes that tax increase permanent. So it's not subject to being reduced again 5 or 6 years down the road, like the last time they increased it. And it indexes for inflation. So that number is 15 million this year. Next year, that number could be 15.5 million dollars because of the inflation rate this year. And each year that number will get higher. That's good news for people in the higher income brackets, obviously higher wealth brackets. Because when you if two folks are married and they're going to combine that estate tax exemption, that puts you at $30 million you can leave estate tax free at the time of your death. That covers a lot of people, something less than the $30 million.
Yeah.
But it also, if you are that business owner, you and your wife have built your business over all these years, and it's now starting to really grow in value. It does give you $30 million worth of ability during your lifetime to give that away or at your death, and not have your kids have to sell the business in order to pay the taxes. So it does provide some good flexibility and good benefit.
Okay. And has there been anything as far as that specific situation you gave? Like, I guess it comes from the same, like, have to sell the family farm because like these big businesses were passed on and because the value was really high, but there was really no cash. They had to
Right.
sell the farm to pay the tax. So like, was anything in the law kind of changed to handle that, like kind of high value assets, but people didn't have the cash to actually pay for the tax?
Yeah, so look, there's this is not necessarily a recent change, but there is an opportunity. In fact, we've got an estate right now that we're working on that has this exact same issue. There were 7 or 8 thousand acres of ranch land, significant value, but not as much cash to be able to pay the tax liability related to that. So there is an opportunity to basically do a 10-year payout on that with the Internal Revenue Service. So you can pay it out over time. Now there is an interest rate, and it's not a small interest rate, but there is that option to be able to pay that out over time, and do that. Look, depending on the interest rates and what you could borrow at a bank versus what you could borrow from the government, you might think about borrowing against the ranch and paying it off at a lower interest rate than what the government would have you do. But there is a payout option that does provide some relief on that. And look, in 25 years ago, 2001, the estate tax exemption went up to $1 million, and that was considered to be a high value because it had been lower than that for a long time. By 2010, it got up to $5 million. And so in the last 15 years, we've seen really kind of this pretty significant uptick in the value of the estate tax exemption. So that now $30 million is really a pretty significant increase that does provide relief to a lot of those families with farms and stuff like that.
Okay, got it. Good to know. Now, Don, I do have one last question for you, but before I ask it, I do want to point people to your website at fordbergner.com.
Yes.
Now, last question for you. What does peace of mind mean to you?
In the estate planning context or generally?
We'll go with the estate planning side.
Yeah, look, so I think peace of mind for clients is um, knowing if mom or dad dies, that what they're leaving is going to go to their kids. They're not going to pay a lot of taxes on it. There's not going to be a lot of fights because we've, set out who's going to get it. Um, and if they have a business like we talked about, that the business is going to have to be sold or it's not going to be impaired because one of them passed away, and that they're going to be leaving something to their children, that their children and their grandchildren, next generations, are going to benefit from all the efforts that they put in during their lifetimes. I see a lot of clients who really place value on being able to leave something to their children and something to their future generations, so that their life left something behind for those future parts of their family. So I think peace of mind for a lot of clients is that knowing that they've been able to leave something and it's going to get to those people and there's not going to be fights, and that they've left a legacy for their family members.
Okay, well, there you have it. Don sharing his expertise. So, Don, where can people contact you in your practice?
So look, our website, fordbergner.com, is a great place to find us. You can always Google Don Ford, estate planning attorney in Texas, and you'll certainly find me. And we have offices in Houston, Dallas, and Austin. So we kind of end up doing work all over the state of Texas, which is a pretty large place. And so, always happy to help people.
Awesome. Well, Don, this is great. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and thanks for sharing your expertise.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. It was great to see you.
Thanks for listening to the Verdict Signal podcast. Any questions? Please contact the practice directly with the contact information provided during the show. We'll see you again next time. Bye for now.